Here is something Washington does not want to say out loud. The 6 Americans who came home to Dover Air Force Base yesterday in transfer cases draped in flags, carried by white gloved hands across the tarmac, while their families stood a few feet away. Those 6 soldiers may have been found by Russian satellites, not Iranian satellites. Russian Maj Jeffrey O'Brien of Indianola, Iowa, capped. Cody Cork of Winter Haven, Florida, Sergeant First Class Noah Tianjins of Bellevue, Nebraska, Sergeant First Class Nicole Amore of White Bear Lake, Minnesota, just days from coming home, Sergeant Declan Cody of West Des Moines, Iowa, 20 years old, still a university student, and Chief Warrant Officer Robert Marzan. They were working in a shipping container-style building at a civilian port in Kuwait, Port Shuaiba, 10 miles from their main base, Camp Arishan. No overhead protection, no drone defeat systems, no warning siren when the drone came in. According to reporting published Friday by the Washington Post, NBC News, and CNN, all citing U.S. officials familiar with the intelligence, Russia has been sharing targeting information with Iran since this war began on February 28th, the locations of American warships, aircraft, bases, overhead satellite imagery from Moscow's Constellation, what one official described as a pretty comprehensive effort. I spent 27 years inside the CIA watching the gap between what governments say and what the intelligence actually shows. I would tell you that this story is not the surprise. The surprise is how long anyone expected it to stay hidden. That is what we're going to work through today. What Russia is doing, why it is doing it, what it means for the Americans still in theater, and what it says about the shape of the conflict the United States has now entered. I used to make a distinction that most people never learn to make. I separated intelligence, the actual information gathered carefully, assessed honestly, from intelligence as a political instrument shaped to serve a conclusion that somebody with power had already reached. I saw the difference used honestly under some presidents and abused badly under others. I saw analysts who held the line under pressure. I saw many more who didn't. And for the last 35 years of my public life, after leaving the CIA in 1990, I spent my energy doing the thing that institutional analysts rarely can, saying what the evidence actually shows. Without a career to protect, the Russia-Iran intelligence story is, at its core, a story about what happens when multiple governments decide that their interests are better served by indirect conflict than direct confrontation. It is not a new dynamic, but the specific configuration we are watching right now, Russian satellite imagery guiding Iranian drones toward American soldiers operating out a civilian port in Kuwait, is a degree of entanglement that we have not seen since the Cold War. What you are about to hear is my attempt to see this the way I would have seen it, not from the briefing room where the talking points are prepared, from the step back, the longer view, the question that nobody at the podium wants to answer. Here is what we know, here is what it means, and here is what the history suggests comes next. Let us be precise about what has been reported because the details matter, according to 3 officials cited by the Washington Post and separately confirmed to NBC News by 4 sources familiar with U.S. intelligence reporting. Russia has been passing Iran the locations of American military assets, warships, aircraft bases since the start of Operation Epic Fury on February 28. Much of the intelligence involves overhead imagery from Russia's satellite constellation. One official called it a pretty comprehensive effort. The AP separately reported that U.S. officials do not believe Russia is directing Iranian strikes. only providing the targeting picture. CNN added that China may be preparing to provide Iran with financial assistance, spare parts, and missile components, though Beijing has stayed out of direct involvement so far. When asked on CBS News' 60 Minutes, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said, "We're tracking everything." The White House press secretary declined to say whether President Trump had spoken to Putin about the reports. Trump himself, when Fox News' Peter Doocy raised the question at a White House meeting, told him it was a stupid question and moved on. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters only that Russia is in dialogue with Iranian leadership. I would look at that non-answer from Peskov and at Trump's dismissal and say, pay attention to what people choose not to deny. When a government does not deny something of this magnitude, that is itself a data point. Now, what is Russia actually sharing and how does it work? Russia operates one of the most capable satellites, one of the most capable satellitions in the world. The system includes optical imaging satellites, radar imaging satellites that work through cloud cover and at night, and signals intelligence platforms that can intercept electronic emissions from military systems. When a warship moves, when an aircraft parks on a flight line, when a logistics unit relocates from one base to a civilian port, those movements can be visible to overhead systems. The question has never been whether Russia could see American forces in the Gulf. It is whether it would share what it saw with an adversary actively attacking them. Now it has answered that question. This is what I meant when I talked about the danger of policy running ahead of intelligence. Nobody in Washington appears to have asked seriously, if we start this war, what does Russia do? Because the 2025 Strategic Partnership Treaty between Russia and Iran was not a secret. It was signed publicly. It contains provisions for countering threats to either signatory. And yet the intelligence justification for the war was presented as though Russia would do what it did when the June 2025 strikes happened, issue a stern diplomatic statement and nothing more. The June 2025 playbook did not hold, and 6 Americans came home in flag-draped transfer cases from a shipping container in a civilian port. To understand why the Russian intelligence development matters operationally, you have to look at what happened at Port Shuaiba. The 6 Americans killed on March 1st were Army Reserve soldiers, logistics specialists, supply and sustainment troops. They had relocated from Camp Arifjan, the main U.S. Army base in Kuwait, roughly 10 miles south to the civilian port, specifically because they were worried their base was going to get hit. Joey Amor, the husband of Sergeant First Class Nicole Amor, told the Associated Press they were dispersing because they were in fear that the base they were on was going to get attacked, and they felt it was safer in smaller groups in separated places. So they moved off the main base into a shipping container-style office building surrounded by oil storage tanks and refineries, concrete barriers around the perimeter to stop car bombs, nothing overhead, no counter-drone system. 3 officials told CBS News that prior to the attack, there had been discussions on the ground about whether the facility should not have been used at all, that it concentrated too many people in an indefensible location. One source told CBS News directly, we basically had no drone defeat capability. The drone came in, no siren, the building struck dead center from above. Now hold that picture and overlay the Russian intelligence reporting. Iran's inability to locate American forces had been degraded since the strikes began. That is confirmed by the same officials who identified the Russian intelligence sharing of Iran's ISAR intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability had taken damage, but Russia's had not. And if Moscow was passing Tehran the updated locations of American assets as units dispersed and relocated, then the drone that found those soldiers in a civilian port 10 miles from their base may have found them through Russian eyes. I spent decades making the point that the most dangerous gap in Washington is not the gap between what we know and what the enemy knows. It is the gap between what we assume and what is actually true. The assumption was this war stays contained, Iran retaliates, but with degraded capacity, Russia watches from the sidelines. The Gulf states stay quiet. None of those assumptions have held. 11 American military outposts have been hit. Bases belonging to France and Britain have been struck, as belonging to France and Britain has their ceasefire from 2024 ended on March 2nd when rockets were fired into Israel. The U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia was hit by Iranian drones. Gulf states that lobbied against this war are now absorbing Iranian missiles. When you build a war plan on assumptions that don't hold, and then the intelligence picture shifts in ways you didn't account for, the gap between intention and outcome opens very fast. That gap is measured in people. The question that gets asked least carefully is the one that matters most here. Why? Russia is not helping Iran because it is fond of the Islamic Republic. The relationship is transactional, documented, and has been deepening for specific reasons. Start with Ukraine. Over the past 4 years of war, Russia has expended an enormous quantity of its artillery, munitions, armored vehicles, and air defense missiles. It turned to Iran for resupply. Iran provided hundreds of thousands of Shahed drones, the same kamikaze drone type that the preliminary battle damage assessment suggests killed the Americans in Kuwait. The 2025 Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership formalized what had already been a working military relationship. So, from Moscow's perspective, Iran is not just a part, it is a country Russia owes a debt of strategic material. And beyond that, it is one of a diminishing number of governments in the world willing to operate openly in Russia's orbit. There's also something colder at work. Russia has a direct interest in the United States being tied down in a major Middle East war at precisely the moment when the Ukraine situation is unresolved and American political attention is split. Every week that the U.S. military, political leadership, and defense industrial capacity is focused on the Persian Gulf is a week less of focused pressure on the European theater. That is not conspiracy. That is what states with competing interests do. McGovern would not call it sinister. He would call it rational. What does Russia risk? The Reef/Ariel report from March 6 notes the delicacy of this for the Kremlin. U.S.-Russian relations are already at a low point over Ukraine. There are ongoing negotiations about the Ukraine war in which Washington is a party. If Russia is confirmed to be actively enabling Iranian attacks on American soldiers, the domestic and legislative pressure in the United States to respond to Moscow directly becomes very hard for any administration to manage. The Washington Post called Russia's satellite constellation and Quisit's intelligence capability and noted this signals one, America's biggest nuclear competitors is now involved in the war. That is not language that gets used casually. McGovern spent his career watching great power competition operate just below the threshold of direct confrontation Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Nicaragua, Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the CIA armed the Mujahideen against Soviet troops. These were all moments where two nuclear powers found ways to bleed each other without crossing the line that triggers a direct exchange. We're in one of those moments now. And the line, as always, is real but not precisely drawn. There are approximately 40,000 American military personnel deployed across the Gulf region, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq. They are spread across multiple installations, some of which are major hardened bases, and some of which, as Port Shuaiba made clear, are not. The addition of Russian satellite intelligence to Iran's targeting picture changes the threat calculus in several specific ways. First, dispersion, which is the standard defensive response to missile and drone threats, becomes less effective when units move off main bases to smaller distributed locations to reduce their signature. Those moves can be tracked from overhead. The people in Kuwait thought they were safer by spreading out. The overhead picture may have made them easier, not harder to find. Second, the window for repositioning ships and aircraft narrows. A carrier strike group moving through the Gulf generates a substantial overhead signature. If Iran has real time or near real time updates on those positions from Russian satellites, the tactical advantages that come with maneuver are reduced. Third, it adds a layer of uncertainty to the intelligence picture. American planners now have to account not just for what Iran can see with its own assets, which have been degraded, but what Russia is choosing to spare and how current that information is. We're tracking everything, as Hegseth said, means the US is watching the watchers. That takes resources and attention away from other problems. The senators and members of Congress who have been raising questions about the war's authorization and planning now have something very specific to press on. The Washington Post reported that a Pentagon source told Congress in a closed door briefing that there was no intelligence suggesting Iran was planning to attack U.S. forces first, that the preemptive justification used to authorize the strikes was contested inside the intelligence community before the first bomb fell. I made this point repeatedly about Iraq in 2002 and 2003. When the intelligence community's private assessments contradict the public justifications, and that contradiction is only revealed later, the people paying the price are not the ones who made the call. They're the ones in the shipping container buildings with no overhead protection in civilian ports. It is worth knowing their names again. Major Jeffrey O'Brien, Capt. Cody Cork, Sergeant First Class Noah Jans, Sergeant First Class Nicole Amor, who is days from coming home, Sergeant Declan Cody, 20 years old, Chief Warrant Officer Robert Marzan. I believe with real conviction that the purpose of intelligence is to protect the people who are asked to execute the decisions of the powerful. That means giving those decision makers an honest picture, including the parts that complicate the plan they have already committed to. The question of whether that happened before February 28th is one Congress now needs to answer. Pull back from the operational picture for a moment and look at what is being constructed. Before this war began, the conventional wisdom, the thing said confidently in every foreign policy conference and Senate hearing, was that Russia and Iran had aligned interests but would maintain a degree of operational distance in any direct US-Iran conflict. Russia would condemn. Russia would protect Iran diplomatically in the Security Council, but it would not actively enable Iranian attacks on American forces. That was the line nobody expected Moscow to cross. That assessment was wrong. When assessments of that magnitude are wrong, the right response is not to move past them quickly. The right response is to ask what else in the model is wrong. I spent years asking exactly that question about Iraq. Me and the other founding members of veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity wrote memos to the White House and to Congress in 2002 and 2003 saying the case for weapons of mass destruction does not hold up under analytical scrutiny. They were ignored. The war happened. The case collapsed. The model that said Russia would stay out of the US-Iran war has now collapsed in roughly the same way. The question is, what are the other assumptions in the current war plan that have not yet been tested against reality? Here is one worth watching. China. CNN reported this week that US intelligence suggests Beijing may be preparing to provide Iran with financial assistance, spare parts, and missile components. China has been cautious. One official described it as wanting the war to end because it threatens their energy supply through the Strait of Hormuz, but cautious and staying out are different things. A country that provides missile components to a country firing missiles at American warships is not a bystander, regardless of how carefully it manages its public posture. Now look at the diplomatic. Lavrov is calling for a ceasefire. China's foreign minister warned at Munich in February that this would have regional consequences. Spain's prime minister said publicly this week no to the war. Gulf states that host American bases use their airspace and facilities to host the strikes are now taking Iranian fire as a direct result. What is being built piece by piece is an alignment of interest against American military position in the Gulf that goes beyond Iran's own capacity. It is Russia's satellite eyes, potentially China's industrial supply chain, and the silent pressure of every Gulf government that has to absorb Iranian retaliation for a war they cautioned Washington not to start. I used to say that the most expensive mistakes in foreign policy are not the ones where you misjudge the enemy. They are the ones where you misjudge the everyone else, the third parties, the reluctant allies, the states whose interests you assumed aligned with yours and didn't bother to verify. This situation has several of those miscalculations in it at once, and they are now compounding. There is a letter I wrote in 2003 before the Iraq war began. I was writing to colleagues in the intelligence community who had stayed silent while the public justification for the war was being constructed around claims that the analysts knew to be uncertain, contested, or false. I wrote roughly that the most dangerous moment in intelligence work is not when you have bad information. It is when you have good information and choose not to use it because using it costs you something and staying quiet does not yet. The Russia-Iran intelligence story is, in one sense, a breaking news event, new information, new actors, a development that shifts the strategic picture of a war that is 1 week old. In another sense, it is the entirely predictable result of decisions made without fully accounting for what the world would do in response. Russia and Iran signed the strategic partnership with mutual defense provisions in 2025. Iran supplied Russia with the drones that Rus used against Ukraine. Russia has overhead satellite capability that Iran does not. Iran is now at war with Iran's main adversary. None of this was unknowable. The question is whether it was known and acted on or known and set aside because it complicated the plan. The 6 soldiers who came home to Dover on Saturday were logistics reservists. They kept the food moving, they kept the equipment supplied. Sergeant First Class Nicole Emor, according to her husband, was a avid gardener who made salsa from her own peppers and tomatoes and helped people through dark times. She was days from the flight home. She died in a shipping container building with no drone defense capability, 10 miles from the main base in a port surrounded by oil tanks. I would not let that fact remain abstract. I would name it for what it is: the cost of assumptions that weren't checked. The image worth carrying from this video is not of Russian satellites or Iranian drones or warships in the Gulf. It is of a 42-year-old Nebraska and a 20-year-old Drake University student and a woman who grew peppers and tomatoes in her garden in a building that was not supposed to hold them, found by eyes from space that someone in Moscow chose to open. That is what the gap between what governments say and what intelligence shows actually costs. It costs that. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the slower look, the question behind the question, the view from someone who has been trained to read these situations without a political outcome to protect. That is how we keep doing this. And leave us one thought in the comments. Do you think Russia's involvement changes what the US should do next? And if so, how we read every response. This channel is not affiliated with Ray McGovern or any of his official representatives. The content you just watched is educational in nature, inspired by the publicly available teachings, writings, and interviews of Ray McGovern. It does not constitute professional advice.